Despite releasing 3 albums that are today considered some of the best ever made, Nick Drake died alone and penniless at 26 years old, because almost no one listened to his music while he was alive. He had become obscure and impoverished after years of depressive struggling and failure to launch his career. All 3 of his albums sold less than 5,000 copies while he was alive, and his concerts were poorly attended, with most critics writing that his music was dull at best. While today we recognize that Nick Drake's music is a deep and captivating tapestry of emotion that contains some of the most beautiful songwriting you'll ever hear, Nick Drake was considered not much more than an obscure, failed singer while he was alive. As a person, he was withdrawn and quiet enough to the point where there are only a handful of photos of him in existence, and no known video footage at all. Nick Drake's career didn't take off until almost 30 years after he died. But once he finally received recognition for being the artistic genius he was, his albums have since been recognized as some of the best ever made. So why did Nick Drake's career suffer while he was alive? And what changed after his death to make him the legend he is today? Let's talk about the tragic story of Nick Drake, the Vincent van Gogh of music. This video is made possible by Nebula, my streaming service where I upload videos completely ad-free, days before they go to YouTube, and with tons of exclusive content from myself and others that you won't find anywhere else on the internet. Nebula is the only place you can watch my in-depth class on how to master animations for your own videos, as well as my series about my favorite albums of all time and how they were made. Click the link below to sign up for a year-long membership at $2.50 per month or $4 monthly, or wait until the end for more information.
Nick Drake was always a reserved person, to put it politely. He didn't have a bad life growing up. In fact, Nick's life was quite good from a young age. But almost everyone who met him over the years noticed that he seemed like he was never all there. He was detached, depressed, and cold, even as early as elementary school. While Nick Drake was born in Burma, modern-day Myanmar, thanks to his parents' careers, he grew up in rural England after his parents moved back when he was 5. His father was an engineer, and his mother had a lifelong passion for poetry and music that would end up being hugely influential on Nick's music later, as her amateur home recordings were full of fatalism, foreboding, and depressive emotions, and very frail-sounding vocals and piano, much like the sound that Nick would develop later on.
A seed carries a field of grain. Love lies in the arms of change, as a joy carries a pain. And no one knows.
Nick was given a lot of opportunities as a kid. All in all, he had a pretty good life. His parents sent him to a private school from the age of 9 until high school, and he eventually got involved with sports like sprinting and rugby, and instruments like piano, clarinet, saxophone in the school orchestra, and even singing in his own band. But when you look through all of the writing about Nick, all of the biographies and histories of his life, most people still say that he was quiet, aloof, and generally hard to get to know, even when he was a teenager. Everyone from his family to his friends seemed to only know him from a distance. In the words of his composer, Robert Kirby, Nick was in some strange way out of time. When you were with him, you always had a sad feeling of him being born in the wrong century. If he would have lived in the 17th century as a royal composer, he would have been all right. Nick was an elegant, honest, lost romantic. A friend from his university said that he would never say much, and he had never done his homework either. He was simply going through the motions and didn't participate in school at all. Given that the 1960s was the decade of hippies and ideas like trying to find yourself and exploring yourself, by the time Nick Drake was finished with high school in the mid-1960s, he was smoking as much weed as possible, dropping acid all the time, traveling to Morocco with his friends to find drugs, and playing his guitar in the town center for fun wherever he was. At one point, he studied in France for a few months, where a friend of his from this time says that he would sometimes show up to her apartment in the middle of the night to play his guitar. But he would never look at her, and he would never talk. He just played songs, stared off into the distance, and then left. She said, "I'm still not sure who I met. Yet for someone who was so elusive, he had an unmistakable presence that drew people in." When he was finally back in England around the age of 20, Nick started playing guitar and singing in coffee shops and clubs, and it wasn't long before he ended up being introduced to the now legendary record producer Joe Boyd, who after just a few months of listening to Nick's demos recorded on tape in his college dorm, saw a huge potential in him and offered him a full-time recording contract. Joe Boyd would later tell the story of offering Nick a recording contract, telling him he wanted to make him a full album with a promotion cycle through a major label, and how the only thing Nick said in response was, Okay, sure. Nick dropped out of college to work on his first album, 5 Leaves Left. But the production process ended up being a chaotic mess. Nick's vision for the album was that he wanted it to be intimate, with simple, close-up vocals, not like the shiny pop reverb sound that was in style at the time. But the composer they had picked to put the songs together ended up creating an overly mainstream and watered-down sound regardless. So Nick wanted to restart everything from scratch and have his college friend Robert Kirby completely redo the strings and woodwind instruments. Joe Boyd thought it was a pretty bad idea to bring in a college student with no experience to do such an important job, but it ended up working perfectly, and Nick Drake's debut record, 5 Leaves Left, came to life as a masterpiece album with moody, melancholy lyrics that stand in contrast to the smooth, warm, peaceful, welcoming instrumentals.
Can you now recall all that you have known? Will you never fall?
5 Leaves Left is full of simple yet beautiful songs like Riverman, Fruit Tree, and Time Has Told Me that paint a picture of life from a lens of quiet composure. Everything is comfortable sounding. No part of this album blasts you away with some dated sounding 1960s pop style, which can sound so overwhelmingly boring today. In this way, it feels timeless because it's so subdued and subtle. Even when Nick's songwriting detaches itself from reality and his lyrics touch on more strange and conceptual ideas, the beauty of his guitar keeps the music grounded in a familiar and comforting way.
When the game's been fought, newspaper blown across the court, lost much sooner than you would have thought.
Songs like Fruit Tree, Riverman, and the cello song feel particularly beautiful as he eloquently touches on themes of life, death, fame, and on Fruit Tree in particular, seems to almost predict his own future. He sings, "Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stalk is in the ground."
Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stalk is in the ground. So men of fame can never find a way till time has flown far from their dying day.
As Nick sings "Life is but a memory, it happened long ago," you can feel his disconnect from the real world. In that way, I think while the music may feel smooth or simple, beneath the calm surface there is a dreamy, surreal universe that could only exist in the mind of a true artist. He draws heavily on images of nature and the way that nature exists outside the human spirit. He uses it as a force to illustrate his own insignificance in a melancholy way. And it feels this way the whole record through, mysteriously beautiful. But most importantly, it's timeless. I have no appetite for 60s music, but this is different. It doesn't feel like it relies on any of the trends that made the 60s sound like the 60s. It's too disconnected from reality to really remind you of anything. When you listen to it, it truly shows us how much of a genius Nick Drake was. But at the same time, it made the album a massive commercial failure. It's been written that Joe Boyd, Nick's manager, fully believed that Nick was going to follow in the footsteps of Leonard Cohen and sell 100,000 copies on his debut album from out of nowhere. But ultimately, 5 Leaves Left sold less than 5,000 copies, and it got little to no radio airtime, which was a hugely important aspect of music promotion at the time. It was more or less a flop. Why exactly the album failed is uncertain. It could be that Nick just didn't have enough mass appeal with intricate guitar playing, subtle melodies, and deep songwriting without choruses or hooks or rock band instrumentals. But either way, the album just didn't take off. Magazine critics wrote that it was poetic yet boring, and it didn't help that Nick refused to do interviews with radio shows or newspapers. And because 5 Leaves Left didn't get good reviews or sell many copies, Nick Drake's parents were very angry that he decided to leave university and keep making music. They wrote him multiple letters about how finishing school would give him a good sense of security that music never could. And much to their dismay, as well as Nick's, things only got worse from there. Nick didn't have an apartment, so he would just drift from friend to friend and stay on people's floors and couches. Eventually, his manager paid for him to get a room in a shared apartment. While they were still trying to promote and sell 5 Leaves Left, they were able to book a few small concerts that ended up being yet another string of massive disasters, which only drove Nick deeper into the state of introversion and anxiety that already had him in a negative state of mind. Each of the concerts they played, the audience seemed angry that there were not enough choruses and sing-alongs in Nick's songs, and one artist who was present wrote that the audience completely missed the point, and it was extremely painful to watch. This negative experience only made Nick more reluctant to perform live, which meant the few concerts he was willing to do were poorly attended and awkward. But Nick was still so talented that his entire team continued to believe in his talent and potential to succeed, and they pushed on to try again for another album. Unfortunately, at this point, they felt like they were playing from somewhat of a defensive position, on the back foot, and Nick felt compelled to switch up his formula to take yet another shot at the mainstream success he wanted. Bryter Layter sounds a lot different than 5 Leaves Left. You can hear that he was really trying to make an impact with his music. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to be famous. And I think in a way, that attitude of trying to orchestrate a comeback did nothing but doom the album from before it was ever released. And sure enough, Bryter Layter once again sold poorly and got bad reviews. So much so that Nick's manager dropped him as a client and moved away from the UK to focus on other musical projects in the US. But Bryter Layter is still a beautiful album. The musicality is significantly more diverse than anything else Nick Drake ever made, taking inspiration from bossa nova, jazz, pop, and an overall livelier, more energetic sound.
The world, it gets so crowded that you can't look out the window in the morning. But what will happen in the evening in the forest with a weasel with a teeth that bites so sharp when you're
This
not
was
looking?
Nick Drake's shot at mass appeal, and he did a great job, but it just didn't work. After the failure of Bryter Layter, Nick's career more or less fizzled out. To my ears, Bryter Layter doesn't have the same magical, special feeling as 5 Leaves Left. It has a much more normal sound. Its production is less thoughtful and deep, and more poppy and impersonal. One of the big reasons why this change happened was because Nick and his producers and manager didn't know why the first album failed. But their best guess was that it was missing the more pop appeal characteristics like drum and bass tracks to make the songs catchy, entertaining, and radio-friendly, and all sorts of different pop influences to make them stand out from each other. Even though that was originally not what Nick wanted for his music. In some ways, he felt forced to make the change towards a sound that would hopefully be more marketable, but ultimately, it was not. Even though they had tried to make a record that would sound more conventional, more normal, more entertaining, it was somehow an even worse failure than his first record. Right off the bat, the reviews were bad. Critics called it well-made but awkward, and it sold even fewer copies than 5 Leaves Left. Despite having such beautiful songs as Northern Sky and One of These Things First, things just got worse. Nick's mentor and manager, Joe Boyd, who had originally secured his record deal, gave up on Nick's career and moved to the US to work on film soundtracks. And with his recording contract in shambles after 2 failed records and a string of horrible concerts, Island Records had no real interest in continuing to work with Nick Drake. In the summer of 1970, he gave what would be his final live performance, and he ended up walking off the stage halfway through a song, never to be seen in public again. Shortly after, in 1971, Nick Drake was prescribed antidepressants by his doctor, which ended up not helping him at all. Things only continued to get worse, with his sister later describing him as becoming disheveled and emotionally absent, only ever leaving his apartment to buy drugs. But as Nick's mental state got worse, it turned out that he was just around the corner from the creative breakthrough of a lifetime, the most honest, beautiful, and personal album he would ever make. Even though his record label wasn't interested in a third Nick Drake album, with his managers feeling like he had wasted whatever potential he did have to succeed in the industry, he ended up unexpectedly bringing them a new album anyway at the end of 1971. The album that would immortalize him as a genius for decades after his own life ended. Pink Moon was recorded in the span of just 2 days, and it was only 28 minutes long, with an average song length of less than 2.5 minutes. And Pink Moon is the polar opposite of the rest of Nick's releases. It is incredibly quiet, simple, and intimate. It's far less poppy and mainstream than anything he had ever made before. I would say it's one of the most personal albums ever recorded, with the most honesty and the least pretense of any music I've ever heard. It's a diary in musical form, and it sounds so pure that it feels like it's from another world. Not our world of corruption, capitalism, exploitation of art, and the commercialization of pop culture. Nick's world is a different one, a more mystical universe where he battles his inner demons in a languid, phantasmal way that leaves you sitting in wonder as to how one person could possibly create a sound with such depth and honesty. Again, like I said before, it feels like Nick Drake was just too real for our world. Somehow, even in his darkest moments as he was tormented by failure, criticism, and isolation, there was still an innocent mysticism in everything he made. Pink Moon feels unreal in the same way as childhood memories can feel unreal. Maybe overly real. Everything feels special when you're young. even something as simple as a summer nighttime. And because Nick Drake was so sincere, he was able to capture emotions that most other artists never could. Listening to songs like Pink Moon, Things Behind the Sun, Parasites, and Free Ride, it feels like you're looking deep into his soul, only to find something both ominous and innocent at the same time. It's eerie yet relaxing, hauntingly beautiful, one of the best albums ever made. And the solitary sound of his guitar playing against the organic hiss of his impromptu recording setup feels like a journey into a place that you've just never been before. It's like staring at the night sky as a kid, not knowing what's out there in the darkness. In many ways, it feels like you aren't meant to hear it. Nick paints pictures of the natural world in a very untouched way, using the imagery of forests, rivers, and trees to remind us of the insignificance of human life. The most striking thing is, though, is how its darkness doesn't make you feel unsettled. The way he describes depression, loneliness, and isolation is more peaceful than anything. Some of the most brilliant songs on Pink Moon include Parasite, which is a dark and almost disturbing meditation on his feelings of being an outcast. I think it's not only the most brilliant song he ever made, but it's one of my favorite songs of all time. As he sings, lifting the mask from a local clown, feeling down like him, you get a true sense for how Nick Drake saw the world, as if he was not part of it at all.
Lifting the mask from a local clown, and feeling down like him. And I'm seeing the light in a station bar, and traveling far in sin. Sailing downstairs to the northern line, watching the shine of the shoes, and hearing the trials of the people there, who's to care if they lose. Take a look, you may see me on the ground, for I am the parasite of the town.
While Pink Moon is made beautiful with imagery of nature and love and life, it's also an expression of some of the darkest emotions humans could feel. On songs like Place to Be, he expresses this idea that as life goes on, things only get darker and darker until we realize how utterly alone and doomed we are. As if that's the true nature of reality, to be alone forever. Despite the song Place to Be only having 3 verses of lyrics, he confronts his struggle with depression in a more self-aware way than he ever had before. He admits that his loneliness feels impossible to shake off, and he thinks he might be doomed to feel this way for the rest of his life. Similarly, the song Things Behind the Sun addresses his feeling of being an outcast because he's tormented by other people's perceptions of him, which makes him feel deeply alienated. As we already discussed, Nick had long felt like an outsider in his life, which made him reluctant to do concerts and interviews and radio shows, which in turn only made him more of an outsider as his beautiful music went unappreciated by the general public. It was a self-destructive cycle, which only made it harder for him to continue down the path of being a musician. No matter how amazing his music was, he was deeply disconnected from the world in a way that made him feel smaller and more isolated than ever. As he sings, "Don't be shy, you learn to fly."
Don't be shy, you learn to fly and see the sun when day is done. If only you see just what
you
you
begin
are.
To realize just how disconnected Nick was and the way that he was able to transmute that experience into a feeling of foreboding and sinister emotion. It's absolutely brilliant. Despite its roughness and the small size of its scope, Pink Moon is by far one of the most darkly beautiful albums ever made. It's Nick Drake's masterpiece, his defining body of work. Recorded in just 2 nights, just 28 minutes long, it sounds as fresh today as it did when it was released 50 years ago. And it touches on some truly universal topics in a way that almost no other music had to that point in history. And even though they had previously given up on him, Nick's label was immediately convinced that Pink Moon would be his big break. They saw amazing potential in the music, and they tried their hardest to get Nick to promote the album with concerts and interviews. But again, he refused. But when Pink Moon was released to poor reviews and even worse sales, Nick Drake realized he had failed again. It wasn't long before his label gave up on him entirely and stopped sending the $20 a week retainer they had been paying him. At one point, it was said that he couldn't afford to buy new shoes or get haircuts, and it only got worse from there. Nick considered different careers like joining the army or becoming a computer programmer, but even though he got a job in a programming office, he quit within the first few days of work. And ultimately, Nick could no longer afford to live alone, and he ended up back at his parents' house shortly after Pink Moon was released. In many ways, the final years of Nick Drake's life were somewhat like that of a ghost. People in his life talk about how he would disappear from home for hours and only returned when he ran out of gas in his parents' car. Robert Kirby, the composer of Nick's first 2 albums, later said that he would arrive and not talk. He would sit down, listen to music, have a drink, and sleep on the couch. But the next day, he would be gone, and 3 months later, he'd come back, or sometimes he wouldn't. In the months after Pink Moon, Nick had a nervous breakdown, and he ended up being hospitalized for more than 5 weeks. Finally, he was prescribed antidepressants. He tried to start working on a 4th album in the summer of 1974, but he was unable to bring any of his ideas to life, and the record was left alone as a failed idea. And in November of 1974, 2.5 years after the release of Pink Moon, a 2.5-year period of mental deterioration and struggle, Nick was found dead from an overdose of antidepressants at the age of 26. His entire career had been just 5 years long. His father wrote in his diary that day, "The worst day of our lives. The housemaid had looked in on Nick at 11:45 and found him lying across the bed. She went in and found him dead. After desperate phone calls, we got the doctor and shortly after an ambulance, which was, of course, too late. The doctor said Nick had been dead for some hours. The contents of a triptazole were missing, and so ends in tragedy our 3-year struggle." While Nick Drake left no suicide note, his family believes he killed himself on purpose, as it was later found that he died from taking a significant number of antidepressants all at the same time, to the point where the coroner ruled that suicide was undoubtedly his cause of death. Just 50 people, a small group of family and friends, attended Nick Drake's funeral. The music industry did not mourn at all. I wouldn't even say he was forgotten, because he was hardly ever known in the first place. It's often said that during what remained of their lives, his parents, Molly and Rodney Drake, perhaps even with gratitude, would welcome the small but steady trickle of people who discovered their son's music and for whatever reason arrived at their door. In this way, they kept a connection to him, though they would be gone themselves before his work found the wider consideration and respect it deserved. But if we fast forward 30 years, Nick Drake had become an underground legend. Thanks to a handful of documentaries and books, his albums went from selling 2,000 copies in 1999 to over 70,000 copies in 2000, thanks to an American Volkswagen commercial from that year. Today, in 2023, Nick Drake has over 2.5 million monthly listeners on Spotify, with tens of millions of streams across most of his songs. And the critical attitude towards his music has changed too. In 2003, all 3 of Nick's albums were included on the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list, while in 1999, The Guardian named Bryter Layter the best alternative album ever made. On RateYourMusic.com, Pink Moon is the 28th highest rated album ever made. Major artists of the 21st century like Radiohead, Iron & Wine, and Bon Iver have discussed that Nick Drake's work, from his subtle yet genius guitar playing to his surreally innocent songwriting, had a major influence on their own development as musicians. But why is Nick Drake considered among the greatest musicians to ever live today, while almost no one ever listened to him when he was alive? I think there are a few main reasons why. First of all, his music was too pure and real for the music industry at the time. Even back in the 70s, you really had to play the industry game with your persona and your music. You had to play concerts, go on tour, do festivals, sit for interviews, and Nick just couldn't bring himself to do it. All he wanted was to make music, nothing more, nothing less. But even more importantly than that, he wouldn't water down his sound for any reason either. When you listen to Nick Drake's songs, they feel perfectly timeless. There's no stylistic corniness that makes Pink Moon feel old or dated, even though it came out more than 50 years ago. From the beautiful, surreal cover art to the poetic lyricism to the intricate guitar playing, Pink Moon is a magical album. It's removed from reality in a way that most music isn't. And because of that, he speaks not to his decade or his culture or his trends, but the deepest contents of his heart, in a way that universally applies to everyone who hears his music. As he sang, "When I was young, younger than before, I never saw the truth hanging from the door."
I never saw the truth hanging from the door.
He expressed feelings from deep inside his soul in a way that reminds us not of the hippie movement or the folk movement or the 1970s. You don't have to be connected to Nick or his culture or time in any way to recognize just how beautiful this is. That's what makes him truly unique. As a 23-year-old, if I listen to this, I understand what he's saying and where he's coming from in a way that I really don't with most other 70s artists. He touches on the darkness that sits inside all of us in such a pure way that his spirit can live on through the music more than 50 years later. You can understand who he was. So the way that he put his darkest thoughts into dreamlike poetry between impeccable guitar skills doesn't feel old, it feels timeless. John Wood, the producer behind Pink Moon, said that he truly, to this day, doesn't understand how Nick wasn't more popular. He thinks if Nick had maybe been American, where introspective, thoughtful artists were more popular, like Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, he maybe could have been a big star. But Nick was far more alienated than even they ever were, and in England, the expectations for easily digestible sing-along style music drowned Nick out of the industry, and Nick just couldn't bring himself to sell out to find that fame. Ultimately, Nick Drake was a genius artist who was lost in time. He had the talent and the spirit to be a star, but he was born in the wrong era. It wouldn't be until the internet age, more than 30 years later, that Pink Moon would be rediscovered and become a legendary piece of music. In the end, Nick Drake's greatest strength as an artist is the same thing that killed him. He wanted to be famous and he wanted to be recognized for his efforts and talents. And because it never happened, he just kept channeling that fear of failure into better and better music that became less and less popular until tragically he died after just 3 albums. If he had survived, I think it's possible he would still be working today, and he would probably be recognized as one of the greatest artists alive. His music feels more personal than anything else his contemporaries made, and that's why it still sounds good 50 years later. It was truly sincere and brilliant. But Nick never made the impact he wanted to make, and his lifetime is remembered as a tragedy more than anything. Would he be remembered as a genius today if he had given up after 1 album and gone on to become a normal person somewhere in England? I don't think so. Tragically, like many of the greatest artists we love today, Nick was only acknowledged once he was no longer there to enjoy it. In the words of one of his greatest songs, Fruit Tree, from 5 Leaves Left, "Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stalk is in the ground. So men of fame can never find a way."
Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stalk is in the ground. So men of fame can never find a way till time is flown far from their dying day.
Nick Drake, who was barely recognized while he was alive, yet many years later would be recognized as one of the greatest artists of all time, seemed to understand even from the beginning that he, just like a fruit tree, would have to be buried in the ground before his artistic output, the fruit of his life, would truly come to life and be understood for the beauty it contained. Unfortunately, his prediction came true. While Nick Drake suffered from depression and isolation his whole life, he seemed to understand that his music would set him free, and he truly did make 3 of the best albums of all time. The tragedy of it all is that he never lived to see himself become a legend, but the twisted fact is that he may never have become a legend at all if he hadn't died. Yes, we can say if only he had been a better live performer, if only he was willing to be interviewed, he might have succeeded. But in a simple, fatalistic way, he just wasn't. His death, in many ways, is the final piece of the puzzle he had created with those somber and ominous, yet deeply beautiful albums. Even though success is all he wanted, he wasn't made for this world. He was a ghost who made haunting music, and his art only started to make sense when it was seen from a distance, the same distance from which his dreamlike music holds the world around it. His music was a personification of the deepest parts of his soul, cold and detached on the surface, but deep down warm, alive, and full of life. Removed from time, but at the same time, one of the greatest of not just his time, but all time. I'm Philip, this is Volksgeist. Thank you for watching.
And if you liked this video about Nick Drake, I think you'll really like my videos deep diving into the making and content of my favorite albums, like Whole Lotta Red and Call Me If You Get Lost, or my class on how to make animations the exact same way I do, because these videos have some of my very best storytelling and visuals ever. And you can find all of that content only on Nebula. Because I created Nebula with other creators as a big group project to take back control of our content. We specifically designed Nebula as a platform to be a place where we can make our best content possible without having to worry about all the overarching factors that can make YouTube videos sometimes over-edited, watered down, or just plain boring. I've struggled for years with YouTube letting record labels take my revenue to the point where I fundamentally had to make my videos worse so they wouldn't be taken down, even though I wasn't breaking any rules whatsoever. And that's why Nebula is so important to me. Whether it's the algorithm or the broken copyright system or production constraints, YouTube is a platform that tends to limit my expression, but Nebula is the place where I can put my best work. And because Nebula is creator-owned by people like me, we get to do whatever we want. We can make full-length movies, we can make exclusive documentaries about music, politics, history, movies. Nebula has it all, with content constantly being uploaded from over 150 creators, including some of my close friends like Neo, Polyphonic, Middle 8, and many, many more. My favorite Nebula exclusive videos that I've made include my deep dives into some of my favorite albums like Cold Letter Red and Call Me If You Get Lost, and of course, my Nebula class, how to use animations to take your videos to the next level, which I think you'll find extremely helpful if you've ever wanted to learn more about motion graphics and animation for videos. Of course, there are also dozens more classes on topics like writing, music, and much more, all included with Nebula, which is a great value for the price you're paying. So if you're interested in supporting my mission to make the best musical documentaries on the entire internet, you can get Nebula for an extremely low price. If you buy a year's membership for just $30, you're only paying $2.50 per month, but you can also sign up monthly for $4 a month. That's tens of thousands of videos from hundreds of creators, including hundreds of hours of exclusive content like my favorite album series and my animation class, all completely ad-free. So support my journey to make the best online documentaries anywhere and subscribe to the streaming service that I myself am building, and in return, you get my very best content in its purest form ever. Go to nebula.tv/Volksgeist or click the link on the screen to sign up now for $2.50 per month for a year or $4 monthly. Thank you so much for the support.